easy to remember.
How long now?
Just waiting for YouTube to start going live.
It should be
All right, here we go.
pretty close. Okay, so Rafe Champion, thanks a lot for coming here and having this chat with me. Oh, we ran out of water. Okay.
So it's been a pleasure so far.
I'd like to jump straight into the main topic that I'd like to discuss with you, which is Popper.
Karl Popper, yes.
Absolutely. So you're a major expert on Popper in general.
Well, I don't, probably not, I know a lot about Popper. I wouldn't want to say I'm a major expert. There's other people who know more depth in particular areas. So I just like to think of myself as a good all-round student of Popper, particularly in finding applications for his ideas.
How did you get interested in Popper?
Well, I got interested in Popper when I abandoned my research in agricultural science, and I told my supervisor, Keith Barley, that I was going to go and do social science. And the next day he brought in his hands his quite old copies of the Open Society and Its Enemies and The Poverty of Historicism, which he would have bought as a student in the 1950s. This was in the it's only 10 years after, this was 1960s. Anyway, I just spent the next week just engrossed in these two books, just totally fascinated.
It's a big change from agricultural science. What was your drive at first? Why did you get into agricultural science, and then what made you want to change?
Well, it was very simple. I went to a school where they preached community service, and I discovered that a speaker came to the school and he talked about the world hunger problem. And I came off a farm and I was doing well in science, and I think the science teacher might have told my parents I'd be good in agricultural science. So I thought, okay, I'll do agricultural science and I'll help to grow food to feed the hungry of the world.
It's a noble purpose.
Well, it was a career, and rewarding career, an exciting research career back end. And I aimed to get a PhD and then join up with one of those international agencies, Food and Agricultural Organisation or something like that. But about halfway towards the PhD, I realised that the hunger problem wasn't really about growing food. It was about politics and culture and economics and all of those things of the social sciences. So I thought, okay, if I'm serious about this problem, I've got to I've got to shift the point of attack. I've got to get to this other area.
You need to get to the root of the problem.
Precise. Well, I was studying roots in agriculture, so
you were already on track in a way. Interesting. And I think everything is about that. Like at some extent, it's not just solving like world hunger that it's related to politics. Everything, especially in science, like we discussed the other day when we met, how politics affect the development of science, right? In the sense that like research of any kind requires money, and money comes from either private investors or governments. So what do you think about the relationship between science and politics?
Well, I'm about to embark on a major project at the end of this year, when I'll pick up one of the things that Karl Popper identified. He identified it in that book, The Poverty of Historicism, which is in the list of Popper books that we might see in a minute.
Okay. Can we bring up the cover book?
The book was The Poverty of Historicism.
Okay.
And it's the top book on that list.
Okay.
That's a short, simple guide that I wrote so people could get the guts out of the book without actually ever having to read the whole book.
When when did you publish it?
2013, self-published on Amazon
Okay.
ebook.
Oh, interesting.
But in that book, Popper pointed out that the growth of science requires several things in the way that a plant requires several nutrients to grow. Science requires new ideas that come from scientists' imagination. It requires rigorous testing and experimental and observational work to weed out, test the ideas to see if they're sound. And as you say, it depends on social and institutional supports, universities, research institutes, learned societies, academies, lectures, books, journals, all those institutional things.
Yes.
And he said, and this has very seldom been noticed, and he hasn't, and it's not something that he personally followed up, which is weird because people, since that book was first written in 1944, people kept saying, oh, Popper's been superseded by this guy called Thomas Kuhn, because Kuhn says you've got to take account of the climate of ideas, and the other people say you've got to take account of the politics and this and that. Well, Popper pointed this out long ago, but he never did much work on that himself. But he did point out that to keep science flourishing, these institutions have to be in good shape. And amongst the institutions, central to them all, is free speech.
Yes.
Exchange of ideas, robust criticism, that is absolutely essential.
Well, who is in charge of keeping those institutions in good shape?
Well, people write books about the governance of science, and no single person or organisation has any responsibility for them. It's not like the roads that's responsible for the roads department.
I know. It's a collective effort, of course.
And you've got the universities, you've got the research institutes that are freestanding from universities. You've got research going on in the private sector. You've got academies of science that where each discipline has an academy, which is supposed to be some kind of oversighting body. Except that in modern times the academies are all about getting funds and publicity. So the academies are not, these days, are very good monitoring. They're not very good at controlling science.
Of course. And I guess my question was how ethical it is for a scientist to direct his their interests and their research towards something that they know that is going to be funded because of a certain political agenda or interest from companies and corporations, rather than researching something that they might find more interesting, but there's no money behind, so there is no way to back it and to sustain it.
Well, you sort of touched on something there that Popper did. He wrote a paper about the moral responsibility of the scientist.
Yes.
And I think the backdrop to that was the moral responsibility of scientists who get engaged in war-related military research, like the atom bomb, or poison gas, or anything that can be used for military conflict, would include rockets, communication systems. And he said he said, he rephrased the Hippocratic Oath. He said the Hippocratic Oath is in 3 parts. This is what traditionally doctors are supposed to swear loyalty to the Hippocratic Oath.
Yes.
And the first thing is you promise you'll never do harm to a patient. Another one of the 3 things is that you'll maintain high standards of professional practice. And there's a 3rd one is something about serving the profession.
Oh, yeah.
And Popper said that's a very dangerous one, because serving the profession can involve serving one or other of these interest groups, that become a vested interest in science.
Yes, it opens up to major problems. Pharmaceutical is an industry that like it's looked upon a little bit because it couldn't be good or could be bad, and it's matter of like perception, I think, by large number of people, especially in this time and age where COVID and vaccine are such a matter of discussion a lot. What do you think was Popper's major contribution to science?
The best known contribution that practically everybody knows who knows anything about Popper would be that the falsifiability criterion to separate out science from pseudoscience. It's been badly represented by commentators. In fact, I just have got an article in this folder about the latest misrepresentation of Popper's ideas.
Can we find the article online, or?
Yes, you could. Yeah, let's see.
So it's an article about how Popper is being misinterpreted?
Yeah, it's the quest for this gold.
Sean, can you try to find this? I'll hand you the sheet here. If you can try to find this article and bring it up. Thank you.
If you Google the title, you should find it.
Yeah.
But the idea is that people have wanted to have some kind of gold standard or a magic formula to sort out good science from bad science. And Popper formulated his falsifiability criterion, which is to say, you want your you want your theories to be testable, which means you want them to be formulated in a way where you could find some evidence. You may be able to find some evidence to show that they're wrong or problematic.
Yes.
You have to be able to find something. You have to predict something and see if it happens. And if it doesn't happen, well, you've got a problem. You have to rethink. Now, he's been criticised on the grounds that, okay, you have a theory and you predict something and it doesn't happen. Well, are you supposed to just throw the theory away and start again? And the answer is no. You've just cast a doubt or a question, and you don't throw it away.
You keep testing.
You keep testing, and of course, often enough, experiments weren't done properly. Experiments have to be repeatable. So he was well aware that the logic of testing is that you predict, and if you predict something by deduction, if it doesn't get the right answer, the premise was false. That's the logic. Now, in practice, the actual art and science of testing is problematic. It's problematic because the experimental results can be challenged. And he also made a very early point about the theory dependence of observations.
What's that?
It means that you never look at just the world pure. We look at the world through our eyes.
And that's a filter already.
Which is a filter.
Yeah.
We look at it through the theories that we use to describe what we're looking at. We look through we measure things through the instruments, which have got theories built into them.
Yeah.
So
and they have margin of errors anyway.
There's margin. Well, that's an experimental issue. But then there's the theory dependence of observations is another thing again to take into account. And he's been criticised as though he never noticed that. Kuhn was very big on the theory dependence.
Yeah.
But it's a fundamental part of Popper from the go-get. So many things that he said have actually been turned around as arguments against him. One of them, of course, is the theory dependence of observations, or he said that. The other thing is that you can't be certain about a refutation, or he said that. And he also said you don't throw away a theory which has done good service until you've got a better one.
Of course.
Okay? So you can know it's problematic. People knew for a long time that Newton's theory was problematic. There's quite a number of anomalies, apart from the very well-known ones. But there was no better theory, so you just had to hope that something would come up to refine Newton to fix it, or alternatively, as happened, Einstein came up with an equally spacious and all-embracing theory, which in some respects or other was an advance. So you don't expect to get a clear-cut, dead-set falsification. You have to take account of the theory dependence observations, and you don't just throw your theory away because it's run into a bit of bother.
Well, not if you're a researcher, at least. Like,
Well, no.
The point of research is just like to keep trying to verify whatever you're trying to figure out. What would you say would be the main difference in Kuhn's and Popper's approach?
Kuhn had trouble coming to grips with the notion of persistent criticism. He felt that we've got to be most of the time not criticising things, we've got to be getting on with our work, which is quite true. You get on with your work, but your work involves testing.
Yes, and that's a way of criticising.
And whenever something comes up that you didn't expect, okay, your criticism has been at least partly successful, and you've got a new problem to work on.
Yes.
Which should be exciting. Oh, we've got something new to work on. The other thing is that it's very little noticed that Kuhn, after a protracted discussion with Popper, came out and made a very clear statement, which I should have written down, but he said, it has to be said that there is an essential role for Karl Popper's methodology. Whenever a science is in crisis, Popper's way is the way to go. Now, Kuhn's idea about a crisis was when Newtonian physics was about to be overthrown by Einstein, but there's many crises. More realistically, there's crises all the time in terms of clashing theories of a lower level. There's all the time, there's debate, there's argument, there's disagreement. So they're not going to change the framework of science, although they may change the direction of work in a particular field, but they are mini crises, and they are, again, times when Popper's methodology is the way to go. And Kuhn conceded that. It was something like page 347 of Criticism and the Growth of Knowledge. I've never seen a follower of Kuhn acknowledge that.
It's interesting. Personally, I believe in the fact that criticism is, I don't want to say always, but at least most of the times constructive. Without criticism, I don't see an easy path to progress and to developing new ideas, to finding flaws. It's just like a way to keep verifying that what believed to be true is actually true, and to move forward if it's disproven. What do you think about that?
Well, people get upset about negative criticism. So stop all this negative criticism. Well, think of criticism as testing your ladder. You're going to climb a ladder.
Yes.
Do you want to get to the top and find the rung breaks under your feet? You test on the ground to be sure it'll hold you up. So, and I remember in college, I heard some people arguing, and one of the people there was a friend of mine, was very good at criticism, and he irritated the Jesus out of people, including me. And people say, "Oh, Penwall, you're just negative, you just criticise all the time." And I wasn't bold enough to get engaged in the argument, but it dimly occurred to me that if he's pointing out something that's true, if his criticism is based on pointing out something that's true, well, that's not negative. He's just telling these people something they didn't know.
Yeah, just adding extra information.
It's extra information. So I think that's a really nice way, as you put it, criticism is a way of adding extra information.
And every time you have new information, you kind of need to put it into the equation and redo the whole math.
Yeah, turn the handle again, yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that you're working on a new research, right? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, Popper wrote this stuff about the institutions of science in 1944, and in the early 1950s he met a very brilliant political economist called, I said his name before. What's his name? I'll come back to me. Gordon Tullock.
Okay.
Gordon Tullock went into dementia late in his life, actually. Okay. He did brilliant work with James Buchanan.
Okay.
They could have jointly won a Nobel Prize, but in fact the Nobel Prize went to Buchanan and somebody else.
Politics.
Popper met Tullock at a conference, and as a result, Tullock put aside a book that he's writing on the politics of bureaucracy, and he wrote a book called The Organisation of Inquiry, of Scientific Inquiry. And in the preface he paid a huge tribute to Karl Popper. He said, this book's got Popper through and through, and I'll just acknowledge it here and not make a whole lot of references through the book. And the book described how a field of research, which he's actually referring to parts of economics he'd seen, can go downhill when too many in-groups are supporting each other and giving good reviews to their papers and giving bad reviews to other papers, so that the peer review process becomes corrupted. And he saw that happening in some fields of work. He published the book in 1965 when he thought the natural sciences were quite clean and clear. He hadn't thought this process had set in the natural sciences in 1965. Now this book derived straight from personal contact with Popper, and Popper was acknowledged. Popper never, in all the books he wrote since 1965, he never mentioned Tullock's work. And no other Popper student or follower mentioned Tullock's work.
Interesting.
With one exception. Joe Agassi was Popper's research assistant through much of the 1950s, and during that time Popper and Tullock exchanged probably 20 or 30 letters.
Okay.
A vigorous exchange of communication, much of it involving Tullock trying to interest Popper in slightly way out ideas about physics. Now Popper couldn't bite. He didn't want to get involved in Tullock's ideas about physics.
Why not?
He just didn't think that they were good enough. He used very tactful language to say it, but I sometimes think that Tullock might have got the Nobel Prize if he hadn't used so much of his creativity trying to talk Popper into changing his views on physics. But the point is that Agassi saw all of this correspondence in his capacity as Popper's research assistant. In fact, he wrote some of the letters in reply, and he put in one footnote reference to Tullock somewhere in one of his dozens of books. There's a footnote reference to Tullock, but that's the only reference to Tullock in the Popper opus. And regrettably, Popper died now nearly 30 years ago, and there are so many questions that I'd now like to ask.
Have you ever met him?
Yes, I had a very exciting experience. I wrote to him. When Bertrand Russell died, because I admired Russell so much, and I thought I should have written to him to tell him, because Russell made a point of replying to everybody that wrote to him. So I admired Popper probably almost as much as Russell, so I wrote to Popper saying, I just want to tell you I really admire your work, and I didn't. Bertrand Russell died before I told him, so I don't want you to die before I tell you. And I did send him some of the things which I'd written based on his work. Anyway, when I went to London in 1972, I told him I was coming, and he said, "Oh, you better come and visit me when you're here." So I got on the train to High Wycombe station, and he said, "I'll be there on the platform, and I'll have a copy of the BBC Listener under my arm." Now, the BBC Listener is an A4 size of thing, okay. So I got to the platform at High Wycombe in the middle of the afternoon. Of course, he was the only person on the platform. I didn't notice what he had under his arm. But later on, his research assistant, Jeremy Shermer, told me that when they got to the station, driving from Popper's house, he found he'd left the BBC listener behind. So he went to the station kiosk to buy another copy, but they'd sold out. So he bought a copy of the London Times instead, which is about this big, and he folded it up a couple of times to get it down to the right size to look like the BBC listener. Anyway, there's a joke about High Wycombe too, because when his friend Brian McGee went to visit him, Popper, he went to the station and he asked for a ticket to Havocombe, and they said there's no Havocombe. So he phoned up Popper and said, "What was that station again?" And Popper's High Wycombe. That was in Popper's thick accent. And High Wycombe turned into Havocombe. Anyway, they sorted that out. Now that was a quite amusing occasion. It was very hard to talk because Popper had no real small talk. We couldn't talk about the cricket, you know.
Yeah. Are you a big cricket fan?
Well, I certainly was then, because there was a tour. Australia was touring England at the time. But whenever conversation laboured, he'd nudge a tray of chopped chip cookies towards me. I'd have another chopped chip cookie. Anyway, I got friendly with his research assistant, Jeremy, and Jeremy said, after I'd left, Karl mournfully remarked I'd eaten a week's supply of his favourite cookies that afternoon. So, and we exchanged quite a number of letters after that, and I think I even got to have breakfast with him when he came through Sydney on the way to give a lecture in New Zealand.
And this direct personal contact, how did it affect your work and your research in your personal, professional career?
Well, professionally, it didn't help at all because when I got into sociology, people like Popper and Hayek were just bad news in those circles. So nobody was impressed by our knowledge of Popper or Hayek, where I was trying to make my way professionally, academically, and I dropped out. So it sort of, you could almost say my interest in Popper killed my academic career because it was incompatible with what was going on in the social sciences at the time, and worse today.
And we go back to politics then. It's you need to either accept and compromise or follow what you believe it's worth following. Yeah,
well, I was still quite young and naive at the time. I really didn't know how to play the game, so I just got upset, probably had a mini nervous breakdown, got depressed, and went out and got a job in the health department to rehabilitate.
What about Hayek? Have you studied... okay, what's the main lesson that we can get from Hayek?
Well, don't be over-ambitious with social reforms, but that's the same message you get from Popper.
Yes. What are the main differences then between Hayek and Popper?
Popper never took on as much of the free enterprise spirit that Hayek had, although Hayek, of course, was prepared to compromise with the interventionist state, and so he got rubbished thoroughly by the strict Austrian school that he grew out of. They were very totally non-interventionist, and Hayek was prepared to find some way, a middle road, some kind of compromise with government interference. Popper, I think Popper never learned enough economics to get really clear about what was involved in desirable and undesirable state intervention. So I think if you make an adjustment, if Popper had learnt more economics, he would have been much closer to Hayek and quite a bit closer to the Austrians as well.
Yeah, we mentioned before we went live, we were talking about the relationship between Popper and one of my favorite philosophers, Wittgenstein. Can you tell the story again?
Yeah, well, it's a very engrossing story. The story is that, well, first of all, you have to see that Wittgenstein inspired the first generation of the Vienna Circle of Logical Positivists. So they're obsessed with the topic of verification. If a statement couldn't be verified, it was meaningless, literally. And Popper's initial criterion of science was designed to provide a feasible and sensible and logical alternative to the impossible quest of the positivists. So it was an attempt to to refute their program and get them going in a more helpful direction. Anyway, Wittgenstein, of course, that was Wittgenstein Mark I. Wittgenstein Mark II became totally immersed in the nuances of language. And at that point, Bertrand Russell could have lost patience. He couldn't see, and Popper and Russell agreed. They discussed it, they agreed they couldn't see anything of value in this particular second turn of Wittgenstein. Now, I think that we can have a rapprochement there, which I'll explain in a minute. But the guts of the story is that Popper was invited to a Cambridge college to give a talk, and Wittgenstein was based in Cambridge, and Popper took this, he went up there on a mission to challenge and perhaps dethrone Wittgenstein. And so he, in the course of his talk, he must have said something about morals, values, and Wittgenstein, at that point Wittgenstein had got very aggravated by the way the discussion went, and he was poking the fire with the poker. Now, there's nothing abnormal about that. I mean, it's just something you do when there's a fire and you poke it with the poker. Now, some said it was a little bit out of order because it was someone else's fire. It was Russell's fire, so strictly speaking, Russell should have been poking it. Anyway, Wittgenstein was poking the fire, and then he challenged Popper to, well, give me an example of a moral rule. And he pulled the poker out of his fire and said, well, give me an example of a moral rule. And Popper said, you don't threaten visiting speakers with pokers. And according to legend, he threw it down and walked out and slammed the door. Now, there's nothing unusual about Wittgenstein slamming doors. He usually slammed doors when he left rooms, so you don't need to over-interpret the significance of slamming the door. Now, a whole book got written about that exchange, and the author drew on all of the living people who were there, and most of the people there were fans of Wittgenstein, and they disputed Popper's account. They thought Popper virtually said he'd lied. It's a slightly unsavoury reconstruction of the confrontation. It didn't resolve anything. Russell deplored Wittgenstein's behaviour. Nothing changed. They went home to bed, tired but happy.
Wittgenstein was he had a reputation for like being conflict avoidant and not very confrontational in the sense that because I guess the main critique to Wittgenstein, the first Wittgenstein list, was that he was overly rational to the point that critique is not ever perceived as a constructive thing. Because like if you apply logic to something to the point that if you can prove something to be right that can never be disproved, which is never the case, it's not an open conversation anymore. And in that case, whatever critique is perceived as like nonsense, and that's why I guess he was just like leaving the room and storming off. And then I lost interest in Wittgenstein when he went into the second phase of his work. Not because I think that, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I just didn't find it as interesting. I was more into the logical approach, and bridging from that, I'm interested in the relationship between like logic and rationality and compromising in science again. So I think there are like many factors at play. One is like ethics and morale, and one is like science and chasing the truth to like whatever extent, and another one is like the social abilities to play the game and compromise and navigate that like social world of connections and networking. um, what do you think is the most effective way in the best interest of science to carry on as a like researcher in this time and age?
Well, I guess that's practically an invitation for me to advance one of Popper's key ideas, the idea of the critical rationalist mantra, if you like, that you may be right and I may be wrong, and by an effort we may be able to get nearer to the truth. That's it in a very small number of words. That's the attitude of
Rational.
What he called it, critical rationalism.
Critical rationalism.
So there's any number of different types of rationalism. There's classical rationalism and continental rationalism and constructive. Now, rationalism means a lot of different things. For Popper, he just said, look, I'll go for this. I call it critical rationalism. And you can't logically prove it, you can't demonstrate it, it's a proposal. This is why I propose that we conduct our transactions and our disagreements. Now, we can say some more about that if you like, but I don't want to lose track of the mention of language.
Yes, let's get into that.
Yeah, because Popper himself has a theory of language, and it's one of those things that slipped through the cracks.
It does.
In interpretation and exegesis of Popper. And it's a theory of language that he picked up from a German-born Viennese scholar called Karl Popper.
Oh.
Karl Popper and his wife Charlotte were an absolute powerhouse of research in Vienna. I think it was called the Vienna Institute of Teaching, and it was set up to support reforms in the Austrian education system that were happening at the time. And Popper had a background in logic and psychology and medicine, and like a true Vienna man, he was totally committed to the arts. He refused a prestigious chair in the United States because he wanted to stay in Vienna.
Like most Europeans do.
That they would have done at the time. And he was the second supervisor or examiner of Popper's PhD thesis. And from Popper, Popper picked up the idea of there are levels of language. And it's very much an evolutionary theory, looking at how language evolves through animals into humans. And at the lowest level of language, that's the expressive level. The sound expresses an expression of something. It's like the squeaking of a gate, or the banging on a desk, or just an exclamation of pain, or excitement. It's expressing the state of the organism.
Yes, it's the response to impulse that can be like
like this
pain
gate.
or
This gate needs to be oiled. I've hit my thumb with a hammer. That's the expression. The next level is description, and this is a critical in human evolution, because when you get to the point of description,
it's pretty advanced.
You can start telling stories, and stories are the start of the human adventure of science and art.
Absolutely.
And Popper's point is that you can have expression and you can have, but there's no description in expression. Expression, that's the higher level. A higher level. The second level, no, stop. The second level is signalling.
Okay.
Signalling. So animals have mating calls and hunting calls. So this function of language is to trigger a response.
To warn others for danger.
Warning. There's food coming or there's danger coming. They are signals, and they're very species specific, of course. That each species has its own signals, and of course they can be misinterpreted, and of course the mating call of one animal might signal dinner time to a predator, so
Yes.
so there's a bit of there's ambiguity in signals.
Yeah.
Now, sorry, the third level beyond that is description. Now, that's where the animals of Popper suggested the dance of the bees, where they dance to signal where to find the honey. He suggested that's possibly a transition case between the signalling to the descriptive level, but he doesn't find any description in any other animal languages. And this is coming from Buehler. Now, Popper adopted that bit of Buehler, but Popper himself added a fourth level, which he called the argumentative. The argumentative function comes in when people don't agree about a description. They don't agree with the story.
But that comes together with description in a way.
Only when you get serious about it.
Yes.
And it creates the possibility of a criterion of truth.
Yes.
Like, this is a truth, that story is not true. So that the idea of truth emerges at the argumentative level of language. So he sort of played with that, and he put it out there. And it just remains to be seen how much people make of it, because they haven't made a real lot out of it so far. People are much more excited about Wittgenstein's theory of language.
Yeah. Yes. I can see why, but Popper's theory is, I don't know, what are the key differences between Popper's theory of language and Wittgenstein's theory of language?
Well, both Popper and Russell read one of Wittgenstein's books, the Blue Book or the Brown Book or Philosophical Investigation, his first major book in his linguistic phase, and they just said, I can't find anything in it. Like, where do you go with this? Analysing the nuances of language has a role to play, but towards an objective of making a decision, or testing a theory, or deciding on a policy, and I don't know, people just get so excited, so immersed in. Now, there's something which you can find in Wittgenstein which is interesting, somewhere or other. He came up with this odd notion about forms of life, as though languages are a part of different life forms, and you can see something kind of sociological there, that there's a form of life of the scientist. So you can investigate the language that people use in science, but then you find there's a difference between the Popperian critical scientist and what you call Kuhn's normal scientist, where criticism is muted to the point of not being existent. So the point is that you can go somewhere with, and Ernest Gellner pointed this out, he said locating forms of life is only the beginning of a task, it's not the end of it. Because having located the forms of life, you then have to decide, well, which are desirable and undesirable forms of life. And that might have been where Wittgenstein got cranky about being asked for moral values.
Yeah.
Mind you, he's a very moralistic person in the sense of, in a strange way, he thought it was very corrupting to do philosophy. He taught his students to do almost anything except philosophy.
Well, philosophy is the old way how science was carried on, but it might sound a little bit abstract now, like not very practical. It's mostly speculations, like if you think in philosophy, like per se, compared to actual science. Yeah,
well, there's a very fine philosopher scientist called Barry Smith, who I've got friendly with.
Reminds me that the relationship between philosophy and science reminds me of the relationship between like science and religion in a way. like a lot of doctors and scientists who claim to be religious, but there is a conflict, and they always struggle to justify, like, yeah, there's a lot of cognitive dissonance in that, I guess.
Well, Popper didn't think that there needed to be. He really didn't think there had to be cognitive dissonance between science and people's religious beliefs until the religious beliefs intrude out of their area of competence and start trying to tell the scientists about the world.
Yes.
I think that's his problem. And on religion, he had a very nuanced position. In fact, he wrote a paper about his position on religion and God. And he gave an interview about this paper, but he said it wasn't allowed to be published until after he died. But the guts of it was he just wanted to make a distinction between good and bad religions. He didn't want to argue about people's religious... If people want to have religion, he thought that's fine. And his great friend John Eccles, the Australian neuroscientist who he became bosom buddies with when he was in New Zealand, and they wrote a big book together about the mind, the self and its brain. And Eccles was a believer, Catholic believer, but Popper just thought religious belief is fine, but the test is what emerges out of it in terms of the way you live your life and the way you want society to be organised. So he made a distinction between good religions that promote peace, freedom and prosperity, and other religions that promote war, tyranny and poverty. That was his distinction. He judged by the fruits.
Yeah.
See what you get.
Back into the topic of criticism. I know that you also have an interest in the environment, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I guess my question is, it's very broad, and it's about climate change.
Yeah.
What's your point of view?
Well, my point of view is spelled out in a book which a publisher just today sent me an email to say he will publish.
Did you publish it by yourself or?
No, I had a co-author.
Oh, cool.
Who do more about the intricacies of climate science than I do.
Who's the co-author?
Oh, he has to remain anonymous because he's in very vulnerable employment.
Okay. Ghost Rider.
Yeah. Well, my position is, well, in a nutshell, there's nothing to worry about. But the worry is what we're doing to the environment by promoting wind and solar power. That's what worries me, is the environmental damage, and we saw that depicted in very graphic terms in Michael Moore's production, The Planet of the Humans.
Yeah.
By all means, be concerned about climate change if you think you need to be. And of course, there's people like Lomborg that are in the middle. They think we need to be concerned, but it's not going to be a problem for, say, 50, 100 years. But we need to be prepared for it. But he says what we're doing now is just doing incredible damage, and it won't make any difference. So all of these things are kind of debatable if you're prepared to get really close to the data and sift through one thing after the other. But the public debate has been practically aborted by places where they just won't have the climate skeptic, if you like, point of view represented. The website, The Conversation, which is funded by the major universities, in a clearly articulated policy, they will not publish anything that challenges the alarmist story about climate.
Which is like a counter tendency, because at the beginning, when like the alarmists were the ones who were discredited, when the whole I'm talking like 20 years ago roughly, when the first scientists started to promote this idea that there was a global emergency and something had to be done, no major university or institute was giving them any credit, and now it's kind of like the other side of the medal.
Yeah, well, sometime there'll be a history written of all of this, and it might become clearer what the
If we survive to climate change.
yeah, no, if assuming we pull through, assuming we make it through long enough to write another book or two about it. But I've sort of sworn off the climate issue in public debate because it's just too hard. You can't, people, with all due credit to people, to get to the bottom of it, you need to have a decent science training. You want to have some research experience and preferably publication in peer-reviewed journals. You want to have a very intimate knowledge of the way that computer models work, and you need to apply yourself to it for quite a number of years. And it really helps if you're not being paid by anybody, so that you can not be manipulated,
Biased, yeah.
and it helps if you're in if you're self-employed, so you can't be sacked for your views. Well, just right now I meet all those criteria. Since I retired, I think. Now, when I retired, I didn't have the 10 years of study under my belt, but now I have.
How easy is it to access like research facilities and like equipment? And because to carry on with research, you still need funds and like collaboration, and it's not like a one-man project with no equipment and no backing. So I totally get the point that you're making, like not being biased and not being manipulated, but also at the same time, I find it at least like problematic to carry on like just on your own.
Well, I'm not pretending to be a climate scientist.
Like, yeah, of course.
That's the first thing. I'm just claiming to have a certain set of qualifications that enable me to form my own view. I don't have to take anybody else's view uncritically. I can make my own decision. Now, I'm not going to start publishing in the literature. I've got I don't want to do hands-on research. I have a completely different role. It's a perfectly legitimate role. I'm essentially a science critic. You know, we have literary critics that review books. I could be like a science critic that reviews science in some respects. But the reason I don't want to debate climate science in public is that hardly anybody can follow it at the level that you need to go to get to the nub of it. What I've shifted my point of attack there to the renewable energy industry.
Yes.
Because this is what's doing the damage. It's been doing damage for decades. Like all of these harms from climate change are basically haven't happened yet, or even though they were predicted, or they're going to happen sometime in the future. But these damage by renewable energy has been happening and happens daily in terms of the wildlife that are killed, the habitats that are disrupted, the mining of rare earths in producing toxic lakes, the child labour that's involved, the doubling the price of power, the unreliability of the grid that we've got as a result of all this intermittent energy going in.
The increase of the price of power is due to the fact that these technologies are not as widespread as old technologies, like petrol, for instance, are used. It's like a matter of mass production and scale, I guess.
Well, I don't want to go on too much about the price because it's debatable how much is due to other factors like gold plating the grid. Now, there's a complicated debate, but the fact of the matter is that the price of power has probably doubled since we started putting unreliable energy into the grid. We're promised that it's going to get cheaper. I think it might have plateaued, so I think maybe it's not immediately going to get more expensive. But because of the phenomenon which I mentioned about wind droughts, when there's not enough wind to get any wind power for like a day or two at a time, This just means that we're stuck with the need for 100% backup of conventional power until we have solved the storage issue.
Yeah,
Now, until that time, we're going to have a hybrid power system.
absolutely.
We're going to have all these windmills and solar panels, and we're going to have to stick with conventional power if we want lights to stay on.
Which is what happens with most electric cars. Like at first they started with the hybrid cars because electric itself was not was not generating enough power to meet certain like standards, or at least what the customer base
What people
wanted.
want, yeah.
Yeah, and I understand this is a very like controversial topic and point of view. One of the main reasons why electric is not efficient is storing energy, basically, and there is a huge argument about batteries, basically, because lithium, and people claim that is scarce resource, but other people claim that there is plenty of lithium to keep producing batteries, just like matter of like developing the necessary technology to extract it and getting the right political agreements with the country where the most lithium is, like so do you think we would be able to reach a point where we actually pass this plateau and we get to the point where renewable energy are gonna be more because I agree that like they do generate waste, but at the same time they also do produce cleaner energy to an extent. If you disregard the dismantling this technology is part of it. So do you think is it realistic that renewable energy are gonna take the place of petrol, and what's the consequence of that?
Well, I keep saying that the problem with electric cars is they run on electricity. And if we get short of electricity, it's going to be very hard to fuel a lot of electric cars. And if we don't have 100% backup of conventional power, we're going to be short of electricity.
What could be a cause of like running short of electricity?
Well, wind droughts and night time. Like at night, there's no solar energy input. It's okay, so you can spend some tens of thousands of dollars to fuel a single freestanding house with batteries fed off your panels. But that's only some fraction of houses that can do that, and houses are only 1/3 of the total demand for electricity.
Yeah, I guess the argument is that like at some point the technology that build batteries is gonna improve to the extent that we're gonna be able to store a massive amount of energy. At the same time, night only lasts 10 hours, 12 hours. Like the sun is gonna rise again, and yes, wind droughts. But wind and solar are not the only sources of energy. There's also like hydroelectric and geothermal, and depending on like in Iceland, for instance, they're big on geothermal because of like it's a volcanic area.
Oh, you can be lucky. You can be lucky with your geology. New Zealand is well set up for hydro.
Yes.
I think they've got some geothermal. But
there's no volcanoes in Australia. There is no volcanoes in Australia.
No. Well, they've tried geothermal under the exhortation of Tim Flannery, and that went down the drain. And we're very limited in our capacity for hydro. There's no real scope for another snowy hydro, I don't think. You know, there's just a limit, and we're basically, nuclear power is the obvious ultimate solution to all of that.
It's a bit scary.
Well, not if you look at the experience of nuclear power around the world, and you have a look at the death toll of the Fukushima. Nobody died from radiation poisoning out of Fukushima. Like people might have got burnt in a fire. A lot of people died as a result of resettling a whole heap of people because they couldn't handle the move. They got depressed and did suicide and stuff. But out of the nuclear meltdown itself, it was just a catastrophic failure of protecting the thing from floodwaters. I mean, they just never expected a tsunami to hit.
That was the main.
So the thing is, you just don't build your nuclear things where a tsunami's going to get to them.
Yes, I mean there are a certain number of unpredictable factors, but you cannot be prepared for any casualty, I guess. What's the main reason why there's no nuclear in Australia?
Oh, it's very simply explained that there's a worldwide campaign against nuclear power. It grew out of the ban the bomb movement of the 1950s. An Australian called John Grover wrote a comprehensive account of that worldwide campaign. So that it grew out of that ban the bomb because people were really upset about exploding bombs in the atmosphere. So there's a legitimate concern about that. But like so many things, this movement got taken over by the radical left, and so it became a tool of a worldwide network of radical left-wing organisations who recruited environmentalists, like the Sierra Club in the States is probably the most influential environmental group in the world. They, for some reason, started out as genuine, decent conservationists, and Alan Carlin, who joined him at that stage and became a branch president, saw a transition inside that organisation to become radically anti-nuclear and radically anti-fossil fuels. But anyway, the point is that the
But those are two very different things.
Quite. But this environmentalist started being concerned about nuclear power, then they got onto other stuff. But the point is that this campaign was particularly effective in Australia because it got huge support from the teachers' unions.
Oh.
In a couple of years in the 1970s, they were distributing broadsheets in the classrooms of New South Wales, quite rabid anti-nuclear propaganda. Some teachers objected, but the government, ALP government at the time, went along with it. Some teachers tried to distribute balancing material to try and give a balanced view, and they were basically told to stop. It was a very, very concerted campaign, and it was more effective in Australia than anywhere else in the world.
Interesting. I had no idea. I don't have any particular position towards nuclear, but when we compare fossil fuel and electric generated like by solar power and wind and all of that, I think I see some similarities when it comes to scarcity, in the sense that there is no difference really. Like petrol can be found in some countries and not in others, and the same goes for geothermal energy, for instance. Like Iceland is rich with
very, very clearly, yeah.
So it's sort of the same thing. It's just like matter of like where there's more source of energy. And some countries are gonna have an advantage out of that, and some other countries that they're gonna, be in shortage. So it's just a shift on like which country has the resource, rather than like one resource being more valuable than the other. I guess that's my point.
Well, I'm quite happy with a mixed bundle of sources, provided that they work.
But I mean, the efficiency is been proven. And going back to the cost, I think when you disrupt a whole like widespread industry and you try to implant something completely new, it's not realistic to expect that the cost is not going to be massive. And also, people are like everyone on the planet, they're creature of habit. So everything that is new is hardly ever going to be welcome by the most, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I appreciate that there's always a resistance to novelty, except amongst people who who are captivated by novelty. I mean, we might have personality types that there are people who crave novelty.
Yes.
They want to be into every new thing. And then there are people, of course, who are very timid and hold back and want to wait until it's safe.
Yes.
The balance has definitely shifted towards embracing novelty.
You think?
I think, well, that's just my feeling, or maybe it's just the feeling I get from reading academic literature. You know, where maybe people at large may be as conservative as ever, but I just get. Well, let's put it this way: there's a progressive leftism,
Yes.
which is just into every kind of novelty, and they do most of the loudest and most persistent talking and writing. So I guess their views tend to dominate in the atmosphere of public conversation, regardless of, in fact, in defiance of what the mass of people actually think.
Yes, I can agree with that, but at the same time, the mass of people is not. I mean, the reason why we have politicians. An example that comes to mind is, for instance, Brexit. Personally, I don't think that any politician should ask for a mass vote on something of that proportion, because if there are politicians in the first place, it's because they are more qualified and trusted by the population to take that kind of hard decisions that people who might not be educated enough or might not have the enough quantity of information, they just I see that like a responsibility issue. Like, it's so much of a big decision that I don't want to get responsibility, so let's give the people let's get the people involved.
You've hit on the problem of populism there. And this was a topic.
Lightly.
This was a topic that Popper took up when he visited the United States to the launch of the American edition of his book, and he got to see a presidential election, and he freaked out.
Of course it did.
He said, "This is not how we're supposed. This is not rational politics." And the one talk that he gave to the Mont Pelerin Society was on the topic of public opinion and liberal principles. And he didn't have any answers, but he's had a hell of a lot of problems, like public opinion is not accountable. Like, no one's accountable ultimately for what the vote they make. No one knows how they vote. So it's not. Politicians are in some sense accountable at election, but the public's not accountable.
That's their job, politicians, to be accountable.
And public opinion can be manipulated.
Absolutely. Which happens every day.
Yeah. And so he felt that it was, the situation would only be saved, if ever, by better communication, better modes of communication, more clear speaking. People had to speak clearly, just say what you. That's why he deplored academic philosophy and academic jargon at large. We desperately need to communicate in language that other people can understand. And it comes back to the critical rationalist mantra. But the other thing is that politicians nowadays, whatever they were once upon a time, virtually none of them are qualified in anything except being politicians. See, a generation ago or so, a Labor man was elected to Parliament, and he went into the caucus and he held out, he shook hands with all these people, and practically every hand that he shook was worn, calloused, fingers missing, knotted with arthritis or damage from. These guys worked. These guys were workers. Now, if you go into the Labor or Liberal caucus today, what work have those? What have they done? They come up through student politics into. They work as staffers and hangers-on to the parties, and get pre-selection and they end up in the House, and they've never run anything, never managed anything, they've never been accountable for a balance sheet, for employment, for balancing books, all
it's
of
a
that.
huge shift.
And it's brought us to the brink of ruin, and they're all scientifically illiterate. So there might be about two scientifically literate members in the House. There's a guy in the upper house, One Nation man, and Bert Kelly. Is Bert Kelly? By self-education, he's made himself scientifically literate. So outside of that, they have to, unlike, say, me, with certain qualifications to make my own mind up about climate science, they just have to take what their advisors give them.
Where do the advisors come from?
Well, they're almost certainly green, to a greater or lesser extent. Well, they're basically swamp dwellers. They live in the bureaucracy in the swamp, and they're not accountable either. See? They stay there long after that. They stay while the politicians come and go, and they are the people who absorb out of this. Essentially, they absorb progressive leftism because that's what's soaking the universities, and it's what you get in all of the mainstream media. So the swamp dwellers are essentially not very helpful in providing advice to ministers. That's why we get so many weird decisions. Look at the submarine decision.
Yeah.
I mean, give us a break. How can you advise people to do that? Well, you know.
It's interesting. I don't want to get too much into the details of any specific country, but more on the broader picture of international politics. If we don't have any questions from viewers, I think, is there anything going on? I think I will just...
There's a question from Marco Lapini saying, good morning, Ramon. My question is, what is for you and Raf is the best or less dangerous political system in this historical moment?
Interesting.
Well,
thanks, Marco, for the question.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question because it's a very hard one to answer.
Those are the best questions always.
Absolutely. No, I think that our systems are broken.
All of them.
Well, what do you make of the situation in the United States? You know, and it's not that much better here. And it's come about in part because, again, there's so many constraints on free speech.
Yeah.
You know, that certain views aren't allowed to be written on the Conversation website, not allowed to be heard on the ABC. You don't get them in the Melbourne Age or Sydney Morning Herald. The Australian used to have a decent mix of opinion, but it's shifting significantly one way at present. Less and less balance there. Independent opinions you find in little journals like Quadrant and Spectator and blogs and stuff, but that's small beer compared with the ideas that get out and permeate the whole of the public space. So particularly until the ideas of critical rationalism, the idea of debating our differences in a cooperative way, if we can't get a bit of that going on around us, we're just going to have endless shouting matches and very bad policies going to emerge by reflex, you know.
Absolutely.
So the answer to the question is...
What's the solution? What's the way out of that?
Well, obviously, critical rationalism.
How to implement that in society?
Well, obviously, every student that goes through uni should be introduced to the basic basic ideas of Popper. No, that's the start. I mean, you wouldn't think a person was educated who had been through, let's say, 12 years of school and then some years of uni and wasn't broadly familiar with the contribution of people like Plato, Aristotle, Shakespeare, Goethe, Newton, Einstein, Watson and Crick. You just expect educated people to know that stuff, and you expect them to know about Popper.
I can see your point, absolutely.
You know?
Yes.
Yeah.
it's not the case anymore. What? So to answer to Marco's question, what? Or anyway, going back to that, what do you think would be the like? What is the best and worst political system nowadays?
Well, in any totalitarian system has got to be the worst. But of course, there's different types of totalitarian. The Chinese system is very soft on the people who live in China. People in China can get along perfectly well. They're prospering. They're probably going to do better as long as they don't get overtly involved in dissident political activities.
Yes.
That they're perfectly safe. Russia is more dangerous. It's more dangerous because there's a kind of opposition movement there, which is challenging the Putin, and of course that makes them vulnerable to kickback. The Chinese, of course, the problem is what they do to people like Uyghurs and Roman Catholics, and what they might and people in Hong Kong, and what they are obviously capable of doing, as we saw in the Tiananmen Square massacre, which my wife has just written about in her book describing her experiences in the Cultural Revolution.
Oh, what's the title of the book?
It's probably from Beijing to White Pond. Beijing was where she grew up, and White Pond was a village where she spent 8 years during the Cultural Revolution.
Interesting. When was it published?
Well, it'll be published in a matter of weeks. When my the final edit's just happening at present.
Good. Can't wait. Let me know when it's published.
Yes, you might like to talk to her.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Absolutely. I lost my.
We're talking about which is the worst type of system.
Yes.
Well, you see, but when you see that what's happened in the Western world lately, that the lockdowns, the behaviour of the police, breaking up church services, brutally breaking up crowds, breaking into someone's home and handcuffing them because they ticked like on a Facebook page.
Yeah.
I mean, how far removed are we from a totalitarian system here? I mean, I don't like to think like that, but you have to ask the question.
If theoretically a totalitarian system was acting in the best interest of people, would that still be a bad system? Like, because does it, like, being a totalitarian system, is that enough to be considered like not good overall?
Well, some people like myself and my wife hope that China can evolve to a non-totalitarian system, and it doesn't need to be modelled on the Western system, because the Western system
doesn't work either.
Doesn't work. So we can no longer hold ourselves up as a model to be emulated. We've lost our moral authority. Seriously.
I'm not sure if we ever could, but for sure I can say that, like, I'm not a fan of, like, modern democracy.
Well, I don't know where you start to fix it, but I mean, as I said before, there's a political class of people who sit in the Houses of Parliament that you have to fire a shotgun through and not hit anybody that had experience in life outside politics. You know, it is just such a insular, small-minded view. And the other big problem is that they've got so much on their plate. So when governments just had to fix the roads and have an army and roll out carpets for visiting dignitaries and stuff, and fund schools and this and that. But now everything that happens is potentially an issue for the government. Now, everybody wants the government to do something about their problem.
Yes.
And so this means that politicians have to run around placating this group and that group, and they give out money. They've got slush funds to distribute, and the business in front of them is so wide, and they just can't get on top of anything. How can they get on top of a complicated issue when the agenda is so vast? and I don't know how you fix that, but it just means that the politicians have an impossible task. They're not very well qualified to do it, and they're advised by people who have got their own particular ethos and their own interests, as you know from things like Yes Minister and other programs inside the public service. That's a world of its own too. Fascinating.
I don't know how we fix it. I know for sure that the way not to fix it is by having more politicians. Chan, is there any other interesting comments or questions or anything like that?
I'm worn out.
No interesting comments.
Okay.
Well, there was a Gracia Maria says interesting, really interesting.
Okay, thanks, Gracia Maria. I guess we can finish on one last.
Well, I'm worn out. You better finish.
Yes. I think just as a vague concept, do you believe that, like, is it realistic to foresee any sort of like global form of government? In the sense that, like, some people might argue that a country like the United States, for instance, considering the huge influence that it has on the entire world, on one hand, there is an argument for, like, not everyone should have right to vote because of, like, the different education and knowledge and participation in just like social life. And on the other side, there is another argument for, in a country that is so massively affecting the whole planet, why then people with the right background and politicians from other countries should not have a say in what happens in America, for instance? So do you think would be beneficial at all if the politics of the countries would be like interlaced somehow and everyone could affect each
Well,
other?
my immediate reaction is no. Like, I just dread any expansion of government, and merging governments is just potentially toxic.
How?
Well, it just creates a larger government body, which is even further away from most people than the current bodies. But I guess I'm just not happy with that type of question. I just don't know what to say. I think you have to be very concerned about the way that the United Nations has misfunctioned. I think that's an eye-opener when you really get alert to how unhelpful so many of the activities of the United Nations are. Because obviously, see, one of Popper's dreams was a world government, where he thought if you had a proper world government, you'd get over a lot of all this, you'd stop wars, the group would stop nations fighting each other, and you could do all kinds of good things with a well-run world government. But of course that would be an incredibly powerful government, and the old story is that power corrupts.
Absolutely.
So I think I'd rather break things up. I would say, I just break up the states into 3 or something. No, it's just a fantasy, but I can't see any gain by making bigger political units.
Interesting. I agree with that to an extent. I believe in fragmentation, and I also believe in bringing people together. So, but the two things might coincide. Like, I think this would open an entire new and never-finishing conversation that we can save for another time.
Yeah.
For now, thank you very much for joining me on this chat. It's been very interesting, and thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And good night to everyone who was who tuned in.
Lovely.
Fantastic.
Well, that went quite well, I think.
Yeah.